My wife and I just bought this house. We love it, except these wire shelves are everywhere. And I'm on a bit of a mission to replace these with nicer shelves with some integrated lighting. Because the other thing is that this house also has some ugly fluorescent lights everywhere. The first thing we're going to do is take some measurements of the pantry to understand how much space we actually have to work with. Next, what we're going to do is make some sketches that include all of the measurements that we just took. Interestingly enough, this was actually the first point in which I realized I could just use some off-the-shelf closet shelving from Home Depot to fill out each of the sides of this pantry and wouldn't need a lot of wood from the lumber yard, which I was quoted over $700 for. As a next step, not only do we need the overhead view, but also the side view, which is going to show us what sort of spacing for the shelving we're going to use. And I won't lie here, I didn't use anything scientific. I just measured a family size cereal box and went with that, added a few inches to make sure it was easy to get in and out. Next, what we need to do is actually empty the pantry. And I won't lie here too, this was one of the most painful parts because we just had so much stuff in here that wasn't organized, a lot of it was expired. It made us realize just how much waste we actually had in our home. Once all of the items were removed from the pantry, we could then take out all the shelving itself, and honestly, this stuff comes out pretty easily. Here you can see my supervisor stopping by to make sure I'm doing a good job. Unfortunately, he did not offer in hand to get all this shelving out with me and my wife. Once you have all of the shelving actually out, you can start to take out these little anchors that they use to mount on the walls. And just a note here, make sure you pull out the nail first, then the actual mount itself, or else you might do more damage to the wall than if you just left everything in and try to pull it all out at once. Once those were out, then we could take the trim off because we're gonna have these shelves go all the way up to the walls, all the way down the wall itself. I just used a pry bar here to take these off. They weren't mounted super securely to the walls, so they came off relatively easily and just needed a little bit of cleanup after the fact to get the caulk off. Next, I just took some drywall mud and used this to patch all of the holes in the walls from the anchor points for the wire shelving. And there was a lot of these little holes. So that's why this stuff was actually kind of nice because it spread super easy. I just had it on hand and I could get through this pretty quickly and try to get it pretty smooth so that it required minimal sanding after the fact. Because when I did actually sand this, clearly kicks up a lot of dust. Then to remeasure, using the kind of common wisdom to measure twice and cut once, I use this little distance measure that I just got off Amazon, and it worked pretty well where it was kind of tough to get a tape measure into some of these spaces. Once the measurements were taken, then we could start to cut all the pieces to size. What I'm cutting here is just a few spacer boards that I'm going to use to put between the melamine shelf sides and the walls themselves. And the reason why I did this was because originally I had this idea where I could run some wiring between the shelf sides and the wall, in between the space created by these boards, to kind of hide it, but I'll give you some, I guess, more detail later in the video about why this ultimately didn't work. And it kind of chalked up to a really rookie mistake, but more on that later. Once all of the boards were cut to size, I could bring them back into the pantry on the left and right sides and make sure they fit nicely between the floor and the ceiling. So I knew at a certain point I was going to need to use a circular saw to cut these pieces to length because they wouldn't all fit on the miter saw, be able to cut them all with the miter saw. So one thing that always kind of annoyed me about using a straight edge like this
and a circular saw is that you always have to measure an offset to where you're actually going to cut. It's not like a track saw where you can just line up the edge and just go with that. So one thing that I came up with are these nifty little 3D printed pieces here. Let's see if we can get it in focus. And what that allows you to do is put these, you can see it has a little groove, put these directly in the little groove of the straight edge here. And what that's gonna do, you can kind of see how this works. I designed these, and they're super simple, but designed these in such a way where the space between this edge and this point is exactly the space between the edge of my circular saw and the blade. So it allows me to really easily line up and offset this straight edge to exactly where it needs to be to make an accurate cut to the actual desired length with the circular saw. So a neat little hack you can use as well.
Now I want to show you how I actually use these little spacer pieces with this straight edge that I happen to have before this project. First, I would just mark the desired length on these melamine shelf sides. I would do this in 2 places to make sure I could match up the spacer piece with each mark. And then I would use that to scooch that straight edge in just so that it lined up perfectly with those marks, lock it into place, and then actually make the cut with my circular saw. Once I had this system kind of developed to cut all of these pieces, it was just a matter of rinsing and repeating for each side of the pantry, both the left and right sides, to make sure that I had all the shelf sides cut to the right length and ready to start fastening to the walls. Once all the boards were cut to the appropriate size, I then just nailed them to the wall using a brad nailer to make sure they were plumb and in the correct position. You'll notice I'm not necessarily using any super heavy duty screws here because once all the sides were in place and the shelves were on, these weren't going anywhere. So it didn't necessarily need some super heavy duty hardware to keep in place once everything was assembled. So the next thing I did once the spacer boards were on there was actually nail the melamine shelf sides to those boards and then use a shelf itself to snug those sides up against the walls and make sure that any bowing was taken out of the boards while they were sitting in my garage, which again might have been another rookie mistake, but it all worked out in the end. Next, I used a little frame to support the bottom shelf piece and wanted to obviously make sure this was level across both the left and right and front and back sides of it. And then once that was level with the shims I used on the bottom, I could nail that into place. Once the frame itself was nailed into place, I could then put on the first shelf on top of this and then nail that into place as well. I then used some trim to cover up all of my mistakes and make the face of this look just a little bit prettier. Next, I did the same with the top trim piece, and those with a sharp eye will notice how ugly that outlet looks on the left side there. We're going to get to that in a second. But I just nailed the trim piece just like I did with the bottom, and then did the same with the side pieces. Finally, to conceal those integrated LED lights I mentioned earlier, I'm going to put some trim on the faces of each of these shelves to not only make the shelves look a little bit beefier, but to also hide all of that integrated lighting behind. Next, it was time to caulk and then paint. I went through and just used a tiny roller to do all this, made it pretty easy because I'm not a very skilled painter. So first did the shelves and then painted the back wall and the ceiling, the same color that you'll see throughout the rest of our living room to kind of tie everything together. You'll also notice my very stylish headlamp there. This actually served two purposes. The first one was to see because I had the power turned off in here while I was working on that outlet, as well as to actually catch any areas that needed further sanding because this headlamp casts some pretty serious shadows. Next, we get into what looks like some found footage of me replacing this fluorescent light that was at the top of the pantry here. I didn't have a better way to film this other than just strapping a GoPro to my head, so hopefully this doesn't cause too much motion sickness. But the first step is to obviously try to turn off the light, cut the power, take out the bulbs, and then remove that faceplate to reveal all the internal wiring. But because I wasn't sure if I actually got the power turned off appropriately, I'd obviously want to make sure I check the leads with this voltmeter, or at least I think it's called a voltmeter, where I obviously noticed I did not get the power turned off the first try. So on a second attempt, I found the right relay and turned that off, at which point I could remove all the wire nuts here and take off the base of this light. Once the light itself was off, I could then just use a stud finder to locate any studs in this top area by the wiring here. Okay, so I also included this footage to show that I was making a ton of rookie mistakes along the way here, where I wasn't patient and I didn't wait to just buy an outlet box and a faceplate to trace out and cut the drywall appropriately. I thought I could be tricky, look up the dimensions online, and then cut according to some measurements that I took. As you'll see, turned out kind of poorly in the end, but we made up for it in a different way, which I'll get to here in a second. But I took the measurements and then used a drywall saw to cut out the area for where the electrical box was going to sit. So once that was cut, then I could run all of the wiring through the electrical box and then mount that to the stud that was just to the right of these wires. Next, I just took some pliers I had on hand and created little hooks with these wires, tried to fasten them with my screwdriver here, failed miserably, and resorted to using my drill to then fasten all of the wires to the outlet itself. And then once these were securely in place and weren't going to move, I then just mounted the outlet to the outlet box using the same drill. And then once I did that, I tried to put on the faceplate and noticed my massive mistake. Okay, this is where Fusion 360 and 3D printing kind of saved my butt. So I took all the measurements from the outlet faceplate, then I transferred those over into an extended faceplate that I could then 3D print. And when I was going through and actually doing this, I realized I could just also design a little box that could snap onto this new faceplate to then hide some of the power sources I have for the integrated lighting. So I sent that over to Bamboo Studio, which I use along with my Bamboo Labs P1S 3D printer, and printed this off in just a standard PLA material, which for those who don't know is a very standard, easy to use 3D printing material. It didn't need to be too rugged because it was just going to sit up in the pantry. So once that was done, I then screwed on the faceplate and then test fit the box to make sure that everything was snapping in okay. And this didn't need to be too sturdy, just solid enough to hold on and not fall off when we're opening and closing the door. So once I did that, then I was going to get ready to start to wire up all of the integrated LED lighting, which I first wired up this connector, to attach to all of the lighting that could be removable from the power source that I got off Amazon, so that if in case I needed to service anything, I could just unplug it and replace certain things and not everything if everything was hardwired. So just threw on some heat shrink and got that ready to go. Once that was done, then I went through and actually manually soldered every LED strip in this pantry, which I know is not necessary, but I just wanted the sturdiest possible connection to increase the longevity of this thing. Then I went through and attached all of the little clips to the bottom of each shelf to attach the aluminum channeling to, where all of these little LED strips were going to attach to and sit inside. And this kind of does two things. It not only diffuses the LED light when you add a diffuser to these channels, but it also gives it something much nicer to stick to, so that you don't have LED strips falling down off your shelving over a little bit of time. So went through and did this with every single LED strip in the pantry, which actually took a surprising amount of time. So went through and did that, and then finally I could get an idea for how all this lighting was actually going to look. Then I know I mentioned early on in the video that I made a big mistake with all the wiring in this thing. I originally actually ran wiring behind each of the sides of the shelf, but I didn't test every single shelf where I spliced wires onto the main line using some little mechanical connectors. And when I went through again, I realized that some of the shelves weren't getting power. So I had to rerun all this wiring on the inside corner of the cabinet and use these little raceways to hide all the wiring behind, which after I did, and honestly, once you fill this thing up with pantry items, you really don't notice these too much. Now it was time to actually do all of the cable management in the top of this pantry by these power sources. And here you can kind of see what I mean when I was referring to these power sources and that faceplate earlier. I used the same cable raceways, or at least I think that's what they're called, to manage some of the wiring that was coming off these. And admittedly, I had a ton of extra wiring to deal with. So I kind of had to come up with a solution on the fly where I used some scrap wood to keep these wires up against the ceiling and then just cover them up with yet another piece of scrap wood, which again doesn't look too bad. And I will say, when I'm using this thing on a day-to-day basis, you never go into the pantry, turn around and look up at the ceiling, so it's not something I really noticed, and it was totally fine by me. So all in all, the cable management and using the 3D printed shroud to cover up the power sources turned out halfway decent in my opinion. Okay, so now we're on the home stretch of this pantry build. This last part was something I kind of wanted to experiment with to see how it would turn out, which was to use IKEA pegboard to more flexibly mount all of our spices and potentially hang some pans and just offer a little bit more flexible storage for the back wall of this pantry, which would have otherwise been totally unutilized. So the first thing I did was find the studs in the wall and use some pretty beefy screws to first screw one side of these pegboard mounts into. Then I used a level to screw the second one into and really tighten this down. And once you get this into place, you can just hand tighten the pegboard into place to get an idea for what it's going to look like, and then finally screw the rest down with a screwdriver. I then used a laser level to line up the second pegboard that was going to be stacked on top of this one, and in the packaging they give you some predetermined measurements to know where to place these things if you want to set them side by side like this. Finally installed a third one and was able to get them all set and ready to go. Finally, it was time to put some final touches on this pegboard, get some storage solutions for this thing, and then we can do a before and after to see where we started and where we ended up with this project. All right, so here's what the pantry looked like before. Our beautiful wire shelving, some nice fluorescent lighting, and zero organization, which admittedly would have just gone a long ways if we didn't renovate this thing. And this is how it turned out. Hopefully nicer shelving, integrated lighting, and that fun pegboard on the back wall for flexible storage. I think all in all, it turned out pretty good for a rookie like me. If you enjoyed coming along for the ride in this pantry build, consider liking and subscribing because we have a lot more ideas about what we can do next, and hopefully, this is just the start.